Dear Hilke, dear family members, dear colleagues and friends of Hilke, it is my great pleasure to introduce this inaugural by Professor Dr. Hilke Dijkstra, Multilateralism amid Geopolitics, Rethinking International Cooperation in the 21st Century. It is not an easy task to introduce Hilke, as his field of expertise is so vast, his work is so innovative and also very dynamic. But let us first go back to the roots. Hilke was part of our very first cohort of the Bachelor European Studies. He was, as we so kindly called this cohort, one of our guinea pigs. I was his tutor for the course Great Expectations, at least I think so, which is a course about how the EU political system works, something that Hilke knows all too well by now. And Nomen is Omen. We all had great expectations for Hilke, but the good thing is that they're always surpassed. He can already today look back at a stellar academic career. He not only did his Bachelor in European Studies at Maastricht, but also a Bachelor of Science in Economics. He then went to Cambridge and did an MPhil in Contemporary European Studies. He then, and that's very good for us, came back to Maastricht and to our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And he then did a PhD in political science. And of course, it doesn't come as a surprise, Hilke rounded this off with cum laude. And his supervisors are also here today, which is of course very nice. His dissertation focused on the institutionalization of European foreign policy between 1999 and 2009. The dissertation won prizes, the Van Poelje Annual Prize for Public Administration and the Otto von Gablenz Prize for European Integration. He then worked as a postdoctoral researcher and he very quickly obtained an assistant professor at FASOS. He then took a little bit of leave and went on a Marie Curie Fellow in Oxford. You like England and the Netherlands. Went to Oxford, where he was also affiliated to Nuffield College. He then received tenure at our faculty in January 2015, and the rest is history. Hilke is an expert in global governance, multilateralism, and international organizations. And his expertise came to really flourish and was also very well invested in an ERC research project. And in that project, and I think that's also rather unique, all the PhDs graduated in time. And he's also the project coordinator of a Horizon project on how the EU and its members can transform global governance. And it is typical Hilke that although he manages to do so much, and there's much more that I could say, he's of course also the director of our research program, Politics and Culture in Europe, and many of his colleagues are here today. Although he does so much, he managed to round off his lecture 5 weeks ahead of schedule and was then thinking about what drinks and snacks he will serve today. But of course, we will still wait for this because the main dish today is Hilke's inaugural lecture. And so it is my real pleasure to give the floor to Hilke. He will take us on a journey and answer the question of how can we organize international cooperation amid the current growth in geopolitics. Hilke, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Rector, for that fantastic introduction. Esteemed colleagues, students, family, and friends. I sometimes like to say that I was born during the Cold War. But really, I'm a child of the 1990s. My first memories of international relations are all from 1991. The fall of the Soviet Union, the Gulf War, and of course, the Maastricht Treaty. Now, these three historical events were intimately linked. The resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of Christmas Day meant the end of the Cold War, the end of 4 decades of geopolitics. Operation Desert Storm, brought to our television screens by CNN, not just marked a unipolar moment for the United States, it was also sanctioned by the UN Security Council, which was no longer gridlocked by geopolitics. And finally, the Maastricht Treaty. It was Europe's answer to the end of the Cold War. Here in Maastricht, just across the bridge, our European leaders came together and they noted, and I quote, the historic importance of ending the division of the European continent and the need to create firm basis for the construction of the future Europe. Therefore, my earliest childhood memories about international relations revolved around the turning point, the end of the Cold War and what we now consider the beginning of the post-Cold War era. Now, this post-Cold War era lasted around 3 decades. It was an extraordinarily peaceful and prosperous period here in northwestern Europe, and indeed in many countries around the globe. This was not just the result of the absence of geopolitics, I would argue, but also the presence of proactive international cooperation and diplomacy. It truly marked a multilateral moment, institutionalized through international organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union. Now today, this post-Cold War period seems to be over, as geopolitics is back. The Russian war against Ukraine has violated core principles of the post-Cold War era. 7 military coups have taken place in the last 3 years alone in Africa. And China has made very clear its intention to reunite Taiwan with the mainland before the country celebrates its centenary in 2049. The potential re-election of Donald Trump in November clearly would further escalate this process. Now, geopolitics can be defined as the struggle over the control of geographical entities with an international and global dimension. Traditionally, geopolitics is about territory. It's about domination, about spheres of influence. It's about conflict. But when we talk about geopolitics today, it's equally about seeing the world through a geopolitical lens. Seeing the world through a geopolitical lens. A lens that's often zero-sum, simplistic, and securitized. For instance, it goes like this. If China wins, we lose, regardless of whether the issue at stake is Taiwan, subsidies for electric vehicles, or who becomes the next UN Secretary General. Therefore, a geopolitical mindset also affects issues that do not appear geopolitical at first sight. And this is very problematic when we try to solve all sorts of international challenges. Let me just give a number of examples here. The climate and biodiversity crises clearly cannot be addressed unless the countries of the world work collectively together to reduce CO2 emissions. The rapid uptake of artificial intelligence, which is now also being used for military purposes, clearly requires international regulation. Finally, the next pandemic cannot be prevented if countries keep outbreaks under the wraps and/or blame each other for the virus, as was the case with COVID-19. Now, climate change, artificial intelligence, and global health are just 3 examples of areas in which the international community needs to do better. And this leads me to the research question that our Dean already introduced how can we organize international cooperation amid the current growth of geopolitics. Now let me start off this inaugural lecture with a number of academic and conceptual thoughts. International cooperation and diplomacy, in this sense, take many different forms. In the 14th century BC, Egyptian pharaohs sent stone tablets to the rulers of present-day Lebanon. During the 19th century, European leaders met in all sorts of congresses to discuss important business. And these days, as you can see on the slides behind me, cooperation often takes place via Zoom. So international cooperation can take many different forms over the centuries. Now, in this inaugural lecture, I will focus on multilateralism as what I think is a unique and distinct form of international cooperation. Now, in its most basic conception, multilateralism has been defined as the practice of coordinating national policies in groups of 3 or more states. So one example of multilateralism is the Benelux Union. Because in the Benelux Union, 3 countries, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, coordinate their national policies. But the United Nations is equally an example of multilateralism, and here 193 countries work together. However, multilateralism as a form of cooperation is not just about the numbers. As an academic concept, multilateralism is also about the belief that multilateral cooperation has intrinsic qualities compared to other forms of cooperation. And with other forms of cooperation, I refer to unilateralism, bilateralism, imperialism, ad hoc cooperation, informal cooperation, and so forth. So multilateralism has intrinsic qualities over these other forms of cooperation. In other words, the multilateral method in itself shapes cooperation. Now, academics have identified, say, 4 types of ways in which multilateralism has intrinsic values. First of all, multilateral cooperation is largely about problem solving and deliberation. The objective here is to find positive sum games for the participating countries. And multilateral cooperation often yields diffuse reciprocity. It's not about short-term, one-off transactional quid pro quos. Now, secondly, multilateral cooperation is organized around what's called general principles of conduct. That means it's rules-based, and the rules apply to everyone. There's no discrimination between countries, cooperation tends to be open, and countries should find multilateralism easy to join. Third characteristic is that multilateral cooperation primarily takes place in formal international organizations, such as the UN General Assembly, which you see behind me on the slide. It takes place by repeated, if not permanent, interactions among member states officials. International organizations may even have dispute settlement mechanisms, including international courts like the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And finally, a 4th characteristic for me is that multilateralism often includes not just state representatives, but also expert bureaucracies and non-state actors. Cooperation is informed by expertise and based very often on a liberal economic and political values. Now, multilateralism was not invented in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, but it's fair to say that the United States very significantly chose this particular cooperation format over others as it helped construct the post-Second World War order. It set up a range of international institutions, including the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And multilateral cooperation as a form of international governance was further expanded during the post-Cold War era, when it became the principal default format of cooperation. So we see from an academic perspective that multilateralism is a distinct form and has intrinsic qualities, but I would argue it's also hard work. Multilateralism requires patience and compromise. Take, for instance, the climate crisis. 196 countries negotiated the Paris Agreement. This took a very long time and everybody had to make concessions. Secondly, multilateralism requires money and funding because side payments often have to be made to get all countries to agree to a compromise. If, for instance, we want less developed countries to sign up to ambitious climate targets, we're simply going to have to help them achieve those targets. Now, finally, multilateral cooperation necessitates leadership. The Paris Agreement on climate change didn't just appear out of the blue. Somebody needed to take the initiative and see it through, and this might take, in general, years, if not decades. Now, I will return to the hard work of multilateralism later in my lecture. I'm accepting here today a professorship in international security, but I wasn't destined to be an academic. Some of you might know that my first professional experience was as an intern at the United Nations in New York. There I worked for the Dutch Permanent Mission for 4 months when the Netherlands held the rotating presidency in 2004, 20 years ago. Now let me share with you some of my memories about that time. As I was arriving in New York, so were the world's leaders. They were gathering at the UN for the general debate of the General Assembly. Now, each year, for a week in September, they give their high-level speeches about world affairs to open the diplomatic season. Now, with a bit of luck, I got myself a seat for the opening session, all the way in the back, very high up in the room, where Secretary General Kofi Annan started us off. His speech was followed by President Lula of Brazil, who is, as you know, again the President of Brazil, and then President Bush of the United States. Now, I thought this was interesting, because by tradition, Brazil always speaks first. Has been for decades. And one advantage of this arrangement is that the major powers of the UN, particularly the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France, that they don't have to set the scene. Brazil gets to set the scene. Brazil speaks first. And in this sense, you already understand that the UN General Assembly is an example of a multilateral institution in which countries are at the very same time equal and very unequal. So there's an interesting mix going on. Now, after the world's leaders left New York, we got to the hard work of multilateralism. Our task was to negotiate 200 resolutions in the various committees of the General Assembly. Each morning, early in the morning, we would meet with our European counterparts and we would formulate a common EU position, which we, Dutch diplomats and occasionally interns, then had to defend during the rest of the day in the UN. We negotiated with the representatives of the G77, United States, occasionally Australia, Canada, Japan, Russia, and Switzerland. And these negotiations were called informal informals. They generally took place in the windowless rooms in the basement of the UN building on the East River. And here you see the official journal of the UN. It gets published every day so that everybody knows where the meetings are. So on the 24th of November 2004, you'll be happy to learn that I was in conference room C in the basement in one of those informal informals. Now, if we reached an agreement in these informal informals, then the UN could simply adopt a resolution in plenary without a vote. So this was the hard legwork of multilateralism. Now, most of these negotiations, they were cordial. They took place in small groups and focused on getting the work done. If we reached an impasse, then negotiation would move to an even more informal setting, which would be either the Vienna Café in the UN, which was at the time the only place in New York where you could still smoke indoors. So it was really a popular place for diplomats. Or the chic delegates lounge. Now, occasionally we asked ourselves the question, what is this all for? Right? Why are we doing this? Most of these 200 resolutions, they had already been negotiated in the previous year. So we were just negotiating updates. On top of it, most General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. So why did we bother so much about these carefully negotiated commas and full stops? When I look back at it now, 20 years later, I see that these are the wrong questions to ask. These multilateral UN processes serve the purpose. Here were diplomats from all over the world, from countries that normally do not see eye to eye, trying to work together to solve problems and to reach consensus as part of a larger UN endeavor. Diplomats, individual diplomats, who take a resolution and make it their own personal project, trying to find sponsors along the way. Very unlikely smaller countries who try to get their resolution over the finish line. So I think these are really some of these processes that I've been talking about. As an intern, therefore, in New York in 2004, I was living and breathing multilateralism. This was clearly about diffuse reciprocity, it was about non-discrimination, and it was problem solving. Even if today, 20 years later, I know very well that I was also part, then, of that post-Cold War era's multilateral moment. I want to fast forward back to Maastricht. And as many of you know, over the last 5 years, I've been studying the decline, the death, and the survival of international organizations with a team of colleagues. Now, this for me initially began as an intellectual exercise. Scholars had paid considerable attention to the creation and development of international organizations, but we knew little about their decline and dissolution. Yet, of course, different forms of governance, they come and go. Historians, for instance, have written a whole library on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Once great powers, vanished kingdoms, and yes, there is even a book on the rise and fall of the Dutch Republic. Or as political philosopher Rousseau once noted, if Sparta and Rome perished, what state can possibly hope to live forever? Very intellectual exercise. But then in 2016, British voters cast their ballots for Brexit. And American voters cast theirs for Trump. This made the study of the decline and death of international organizations suddenly much more urgent. There was a real chance, after all, that the EU would unravel after this referendum, and Trump, of course, took the United States out of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, as well as UNESCO. Much of this, I would argue, took place in a geopolitical context. Trump, for instance, challenged the World Trade Organization the World Health Organization, and even the Universal Postal Union, because China supposedly got the better deal. Unfair. Now, in the last couple of years, many scholars have focused on these external challenges to international organizations. The rise of populist political parties and domestic politics, and indeed the return of geopolitics. Yet what I find very striking across the historical scholarship and political philosophy behind me here is that those scholars consider the survival and longevity of different forms of governance often as a function of internal factors as well. So not just external factors, internal factors as well. A city-state, for instance, can be conquered by enemy force. But surely we should also account for the strengths of its city walls, the quality of its leadership, and the resilience of its people. In his famous thesis of imperial overstretch, Paul Kennedy argues that great powers should be able to levy sufficient taxes at home to be able to pay for the war effort abroad, the interaction between the internal and the external. With geopolitics on the rise and great powers around the globe increasingly approaching issues with a geopolitical mindset, the question becomes, what forms of international cooperation are actually most robust? Now, my team and I have developed a theory that focuses exactly on these internal factors. We argue that all things being equal, international organizations with stronger institutions survive longer and can better withstand some of these geopolitical pressures. Now, let me share with you some of the research results we found over the last 5 years and published in a range of articles. First, we've done quantitative analyses of 500 international organizations. And here we found, unsurprisingly, that international organizations in which member states disagree, that they face more public criticism, a higher number of withdrawals, and are more likely to be replaced. So, that's not very surprising. If member states disagree because of external factors, international organizations are in trouble. However, we also found that international organizations with amendment clauses, in other words, those that have the flexibility to change their own treaties in light of changing external circumstances, face fewer withdrawals. We found that international organizations with a high degree of institutionalization are less frequently replaced. We also found that international organizations with more than 50 staff members are less frequently terminated. And finally, we found that international organizations with more staff members responded more proactively to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we've combined these type of quantitative analyses with comparative, in-depth case studies of specific international organizations that faced an extensive challenge. And here we have conducted 140 interviews with relevant officials who work in these organizations to get a sense of the processes that take place behind the scenes. We found, across these case studies, that international organizations with strong leaders are better at responding to external challenges. Think, for instance, of Michel Barnier negotiating Brexit for the European Union, or NATO's Jens Stoltenberg dealing with Donald Trump. We also found that international organizations with weak or fragmented institutional structures are less capable of responding to external challenges. The World Trade Organization here is an example. And finally, we found that international organizations with strong external networks and supportive communities, such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, are more resilient. So really, bunch of papers, a lot of evidence, but in conclusion, we think, in this sense, that internal factors are critical when we consider which international organizations survive. The question is not simply whether states increasingly adopt a geopolitical mindset what will happen with Donald Trump in November, or whether China seizes power. It's also an issue of whether international organizations have been internally constituted in a way that allows them to withstand some of these geopolitical pressures. We find that international organizations survive longer when they're based on the multilateral template, with high levels of institutionalization, substantial staff resources, strong leadership, and a solid network that includes non-state actors as well. Now, what do all these findings mean for us here in Europe and in the Netherlands? Now, when European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was elected by the European Parliament exactly 5 years ago, she noted, and I quote, "Multilateralism is in Europe's DNA. It's our guiding principle in the world," end quote. Now, I believe this is true. The EU itself is a prime example of multilateral cooperation. And in the post-Cold War era, Europe has benefited tremendously from multilateralism and rules-based cooperation. As geopolitical pressures increase, therefore, Europe also has very much to lose. Now, with this in mind, we started a new research project last year on how Europe can defend and transform multilateralism. We are working together with 14 partners, not just in Europe, but also in the United States, China, India, and Brazil. And our project includes a total of 35 researchers who are behind me on the screen. Together, we will engage in comparative case analysis of no less than 15 case studies of multilateral reforms. We are interested in finding out how Europe sets priorities and makes choices when it comes to transforming multilateral cooperation. Now, it will obviously take us a bit of time before we can present our first results here, but this certainly will keep me and my colleagues busy in the coming years. However, I can already say this. It's clear to me that Europe in general, and the Netherlands in particular, can provide support for multilateralism and for various international organizations. How international organizations fare amid the growth in geopolitics will largely depend, as we've previously seen, on their internal constitution. And this is something we can strengthen. We can provide international organizations with more resources, including budgets and staff. We can select the leaders of international organizations and give them the autonomy they need to take decisions. We can build support networks around our international organizations and bring non-state actors on board. We can also put our diplomatic services to work and foster partnerships in other countries around the world. In other words, we in Europe, but also in the Netherlands, we can make the multilateral system more robust now in preparation of what are likely more difficult decades to come. Now, such type of policy recommendations really are a hard sell. Why should Europe invest in more multilateral cooperation if emerging countries like China and India are getting richer? Why should Europe give more autonomy to leaders of international organizations if they might then take decisions that favor other countries? Now, my answer to this is that multilateralism is indeed hard work. It does require compromise, funding, and leadership. If we want the rest of the world to continue to cooperate via multilateral formats, even, or perhaps especially in a more geopolitical context, then we have to be willing to invest in that. Now, faced with geopolitical gridlock in traditional multilateral institutions, today countries around the globe are more often looking at what I call shortcuts. we are witnessing an increase in informal and ad hoc cooperation, minilateralism, and symmetry, such as the G7 meeting in Puglia, G20 meeting later in Brazil this year. Now, while these high-level summits are occasionally necessary, such shortcuts, I would argue, are not going to be solving many of our international problems. For this reason, my research impels me to call for reinvestment in multilateralism. Investment not only makes multilateral cooperation more robust, but also provides Europeans with a way to address global problems as we go forward in the 21st century. Now, as I walked, like many of you, this afternoon from Wiek to our grand university aula here, I naturally crossed the old bridge. And at this point, I could not help thinking about all the European history that this place has witnessed over the last 2,000 years. It took me back to my childhood memories of Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, who strolled along the very same river back in 1991. They bickered and they debated. But ultimately, they demonstrated strong leadership and established a European Union fit for the post-Cold War era. It was their multilateral moment, and I believe that this is something we need to cherish. Now I'm coming to the final part of my inaugural lecture, which I've called Maastricht, My Intellectual Home. I arrived here, as our prorector mentioned, as a student back in 2001, 23 years ago. That I've been able to study here and work here is a testament to this wonderful university, our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, but above all, our wonderful colleagues. I owe them a debt of gratitude. I would like to thank the Executive Board, the Board of Deans, for making this personal chair in international security and cooperation possible. I would also very much like to thank my successive deans and heads of department, Rijn de Wilde, Sophie van Hoonacker, Christine Neuhold, Tannelie Blom, and Esther Versluis. Throughout all these years, going back to great expectations, you seem to have believed in me and encouraged me along the way. Now, Sophie and Tannelie, much more than my bosses, you have been my doktermoeder and doktervater. Sophie, I was your student in policy domains 20 years ago. After my BA thesis, you asked me to help out with interviews in Brussels. Now, at the time, I had no idea that this would be the start of my dissertation and a lifelong fascination of doing academic research. Over the last 2 decades, we've co-authored articles together, we've taught students, we co-supervised the PhD, and we even handed out a honorary doctorate together. Thank you, Sophie, for these 20 years. Tannelie, I only met you 17 years ago. You and Sophie obviously made a very great team and have always helped me out. And nobody had been in this aula if it wouldn't have been for you founding the whole European Studies program here in Maastricht. So thank you very much, Tannelie. Now, while I've been based in Maastricht for most of my intellectual career, I've been fortunate enough to also spend some time in Cambridge, Stockholm, and Oxford, where Chris Hill, Jonas Stahlberg, and Duncan Snydell were generous enough to host me and inspire me. So also thank you to them. Now, one of the great privileges of working here in Maastricht is that I find myself among a tremendous group of scholars doing research on Europe and international relations. Our Politics and Culture in Europe research program consists of about 50 colleagues. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to mention all of you, but I do want to specifically mention Thomas Konselman for pioneering international relations at our faculty, Petar Petrov, Assam Dandashli and Gergana Naucheva for collaborating on research projects together, Yves Rijkers for co-editing Contemporary Security Policy, Karen van Leeuwen and Toon van Overbeke for helping coordinate our research program. And I have to say that Sally Wyatt is, of course, the best associate dean I could have wished for. Now, I believe in team science. Maria Debre, Farsan Kasim, Laura van Alwoerden, Lennart Schutte, and Giuseppe Zaccaria, you've really made our ERC Nestior a tremendous success over the last 5 years. This has been for me an experience of a lifetime, so thank you very much for joining that ride. With Ensured, our new Horizon project, we're taking the next step. Thank you, Clara Weinhardt, for helping develop this project, and I'm also very glad that Lilian Soerdi, Soetkin Verhagen, and Mirko Heinzel will be part of this project as well. Now, my commute from Brussels has been a lot better because of all the fellow travelers. Bram, Christine, Francesca, Gergana, Ike, Johan, Lilian, Mariolina, Paul, and Toon. Yes, we have quite a community of European Studies scholars as well in Brussels. Thank you. Ik wil graag afronden met het bedanken van mijn familie. Net als bij de verdediging van mijn proefschrift hier in 2011 zijn jullie weer allemaal naar Maastricht gekomen. Zelfde zaal. Dit doet mij grote deugd. Merci aussi, Madame Hiro. C'est un grand plaisir vous êtes ici pour cette inauguration. Merci. Mijn ouders en zus zitten natuurlijk op de voorste rij. Ik weet niet of zij helemaal enthousiast waren toen ik als 18-jarige in het zuiden ging studeren. Jullie onvoorwaardelijke steun en interesse in mijn studie, onderzoek, werk en leven heeft mij gebracht waar ik ben. Mijn zus en ik zijn nu Neder-Belgen. Wie had dat nou gedacht? 18 years ago, as I began my research in Brussels, I met Karine. Now, Europe has defined our lives, and I understand Europe so much better because of you. Arthur joined halfway. Now, despite the occasional geopolitics at the breakfast table, I know that with the three of us, it's a testament that multilateralism is robust. Ik heb gezegd.
I have to still put on my hat, I think. Okay. And the microphone. Thank you, Hilke, for this absolutely fascinating and inspiring lecture. You took us back to your childhood. You shared all your reflections about being an intern in New York. You showed us what hard legwork multilateralism actually is. And you also really allowed us to reconsider international cooperation in the 21st century. You also thanked everybody in the room, and that also really shows how you work. You work together with others. You're also inspired by others, and I think that's also a fantastic asset of yours. A thing that I didn't say in the introduction, but it became very apparent also today, you're also a fantastic teacher and lecturer, so that's also a great thing for an academic, of course. Now we can toast to your success. Congratulations with this fantastic milestone in your career, with your appointment, and we will enjoy and celebrate this great moment. Before we do so, of course, we have some housekeeping rules. Because there's so many of you here, I've been told, please don't all wait in a queue to congratulate Hilke. Take the opportunity and drink a drink in our beautiful garden and then congratulate Hilke. But now we will go there and celebrate together with Hilke, so follow the red robes. Congratulations, Hilke!